It's a building material that insulates, fireproofs, and is practically indestructible. It's also deadly. Noted for its strength, asbestos has been popular in building materials like insulation and joint compounds. It was also used in brake pads, clutches, and in and around boilers and pumps. Hundreds of different products were made with asbestos, but it's toxic for those who work with or around these products. Even though it's a natural mineral, exposure to asbestos can lead to a rare and deadly cancer called mesothelioma. As an aeronautical engineer for the Air Force in the 1950s and 1960s, Paul Sizz was exposed to asbestos.
There were areas that I worked in that involved products that had asbestos in them. But again, in the 50s and 60s, it was not even a concern of mine. I really didn't pay much attention to the fact that they were asbestos-containing materials. That was a question we didn't ask. We thought it was a safe material.
It wasn't until decades later that Paul was diagnosed with mesothelioma. Experts call this delay in symptoms the latency period, and for mesothelioma, it's usually between 15 and 40 years.
Mesothelioma is a malignant tumor of the outside lining of the lungs and the inside lining of the chest walls. It also can occur in the abdomen, around the bowel, or in the peritoneum, which is the inside lining of the abdominal wall. Principal cause is asbestos, the inhalation of asbestos fibers or the swallowing of asbestos fibers. These fibers then get transported out to the surface of the lung or out to the surface of the bowel, and over time, over many years usually, they can occasionally, rarely, result in this malignant tumor, mesothelioma.
In the early 1900s, manufacturers of asbestos products began expressing concerns about asbestos exposure. Despite these concerns, workers and the public in general were never properly warned of the true risks of asbestos exposure. Many people are just now being diagnosed with asbestos disease.
We're still seeing a pretty steady stream of people with mesothelioma, unfortunately. We had hoped it was going to go away, but we're still seeing more of it than we'd like. And most of the time their exposures occurred many years ago, 30, 40 years ago.
Often, people who are diagnosed with mesothelioma never even knew they had come in contact with asbestos. For instance, the spouses of people who have never been exposed can develop the disease after washing asbestos-covered clothes.
We see mesothelioma about 15% of the time in people who have what we call bystander exposure. These are typically wives who had husbands who worked in industries where they had asbestos exposure. The wives would shake out the work clothes and launder them, and unfortunately a few of them have gotten mesothelioma.
Sometimes parents who've worked with asbestos products carry that asbestos home to their children, and those children develop mesothelioma. It's only years later that the exposure reveals itself.
My wife started showing symptoms of indigestion, weakness, abdominal pain. After my wife was diagnosed with mesothelioma, we did an exhaustive survey of the places she could have been exposed. The sources ranged from things like building materials on the house, brake linings on cars and trucks, possibly even things that were in the soil, vermiculite, that sort of thing. But in my opinion, the overwhelming exposure was due to the clothes that I wore home from work. In those days I was working in power plants, and a lot of asbestos was used for insulation, and it was not all that regarded as dangerous. And in my jobs I came home with enough asbestos on my clothes that if you shake my clothes they'd make a cloud. And she did my laundry, and I'm relatively sure that was her strongest exposure. The course of feeling ill to getting the right diagnosis until she died was about 9 months.
I was very fatigued. I felt like my arms and legs weighed 1,000 pounds. And it was just an effort to walk.